So, hello everyone, and welcome to Debra and Peter are doing a podcast with President Peter, currently dressed for the occasion in my presidential garb, and Debra Allcock-Tyler, dressed as colourfully as ever as the Chief Executive of the Directory of Social Change. So, how are you doing, Debra?
I'm all right, Peter. Thank you. I'm terribly impressed by the smartness of your attire today and your tie. And I know the season starts Friday, so I'm assuming that's in honour of going into a glorious season of English cricket.
It is. This is the sesquicentennial tie, because it is the 150th Somerset season and our latest attempt to win the county championship, something that Somerset have never ever done in their history. There have been some extraordinarily heroic and less heroic failures down the ages, but we are the team that has been in the first division of the Cricket County Championship longer than any other. So we have great potential, and this is the time of the season when anything is possible. And once again, we're feeling very optimistic, and I shall be there at 11 o'clock on Friday morning down at the Cooper Associates County Ground in Taunton, hosting our guests from Worcestershire for day one of the first fixture of the season. And the weather forecast is great. I was down last Friday for the kick-off dinner, and the ground is looking tremendous. It's had enough sunshine on it. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. This time last season, the first day of the season, we sat actually in the sunshine watching the outfield dry, but not fast enough to be able to play cricket on it. It's a real hazard of playing cricket so early in the season, but all is good. Yep, very optimistic. New tie.
Very exciting. It's a hazard of the cricket fan, though, isn't it? Watching grass dry.
It doesn't get much worse than that, really. You'd almost rather it was sort of pouring with rain and then you don't bother going to the ground at all.
Yes.
But to kind of sit there and wait for the umpires to come out and traipse around in the puddles and confirm that, this play can't be called off yet is really miserable. But I think we're going to get a full game to kick us off this season, which is lovely. So I'm feeling good about that.
Obviously, but not too much luck, because obviously as a Surrey supporter myself, I want my team to cruise through to victory as we often do, Peter. Oh, sorry.
Yes, no, you do. Surrey have won the county championship the last 3 seasons in a row.
We have,
and at Lords yesterday for the kick-off of the season, your captain Rory Burns was there with the trophy. I took a photograph of the trophy. I didn't dare touch it, but I thought that's as close as I've been to the county championship trophy ever. But I hope that by September there will be another presidential triumph. I am one of the few Somerset presidents who has seen silverware won during my time as the president. So who knows? Not that it has anything at all to do with me, but there we are. Exciting sporting times, and even more exciting, my football team, the wonderful, in quotes, Ebbsfleet United, have a game tonight in what is called the Kent Senior Cup, which in a normal season I would not be remotely interested in, but we have been so dreadful this season. We were relegated weeks ago and are stranded at the bottom of the table, so have nothing to play for but the Kent Senior Cup trophy. So tonight I'm heading off to Gillingham and I'm going to watch Ebbsfleet United against Welling United. Winner takes all in the Kent Senior Cup. So what's not to enjoy about that? What a life! What a sporting life!
What a sporting life you lead. So listen, talking of presidents, you and your presidential garb and, your role as president of Somerset, I've been thinking a lot about presidents, patrons and chairs and the roles of board, with the story of the breakdown at board level of Sentebale. I'm sure you've been reading about it. And obviously I'm not going to comment on the specifics of the charity or what's happened there, but there were a number of things that really sprang to mind, particularly actually when I've seen some of the reporting. where, you know, there's clearly that lots of people don't understand, and even actually my experience within boards themselves, about the different legal and formal roles of those different things. So, for example, most people don't realise that a patron has absolutely no power whatsoever over a charity. They can't direct anything, they can't tell you to do anything, there's nothing in law. And, you know, so you can completely ignore a patron if you choose to. The reason people don't, of course, is because patrons have soft power. So they come with money and influence and access. But in charity law, what a patron does or doesn't do is irrelevant to the running of the charity, unless the charity acts on the directions of the patron, in which case, even then, the patron still wouldn't be at fault. It would be the board of trustees who had followed somebody who wasn't in the board of trustees. And it also made me think about the sort of breakdowns that I've seen in the past on boards of trustees, and loads of them, Peter. You know, this is my game. This is the thing I play more than anything else. And how very often chairs and boards don't understand that the chair doesn't have any additional powers in law on a board than any other trustee. A chair's role is, there is a role, and people have chairs for good reason, because the chief executive can't report to although the chief executive reports to the board, not to the chair, you know, the chair's role is to facilitate the relationship between the board and the executive. They're not the manager of the chief exec in that sense. They're their go-to person. But how often boards abrogate their own responsibilities to the chair? And I've seen so many boards where the chair and maybe one or two other trustees have had a very clear view about the direction of travel they wanted for the charity, and the other trustees haven't agreed, and there's been a big bust up. But the reality is that if a chair wants to take a charity in one direction, but the rest of the board don't agree, you have to go with what the board says, because in law, it's the board's decision. It's one corporate body. So if you discuss an issue, let's say it's strategic direction, and the chair has one view and the board has the other, you put it to a vote, and if the board don't agree with the chair has to accept that decision or step away. And the only recourse a chair would have would be if she or he believed that the board were acting outside of their powers, as opposed in their governing documents, out with charity law, or acting fraudulently or knowingly negligently. Otherwise, they don't have any additional power or authority at all over what happens on the board. And I think lots and lots and lots of people don't understand that. And so I've seen time and time again charities getting into trouble because the board doesn't understand they're one corporate body and they're all accountable for every decision, even if they weren't involved in it. Anyway, those are the thoughts that have been going through my head reading that story. I don't know what you're thinking, Peter.
It's quite surprising then, isn't it? I mean, without going into the fine details of the Sentebale situation, because we don't understand every aspect of it, but a considerable number of the trustees stood down.
Yes.
Didn't they? So that would suggest that they weren't quite talking through with one another or appreciating the individual and collective power that each of them had in the organisation, which would suggest that there was quite a lot of power concentrated in the chair. So I suppose that's one reflection that I have. Patron stroke president stroke founder, that's another really interesting dimension, isn't it? So quite a lot of patrons are founders, and they do have great expertise and history and influence without formal power, and are kind of can be used by the charity, but also I think it's really nice when it works well to retain that association with the charity's history, or someone who really kind of passionately lives and breathes and represents the charity. So I had a lot of time down the ages with Esther Ranson as the founder of Childline, and ultimately the president of Childline, where she had and continues to have, extremely strong views and opinions about this entity, which she really regards as a child that was born out of something she really believed in and wanted to do. And I can see that Harry would feel that way about Sentebale, because it grew out of something that he was really passionate about and interested in. But that's not the same as it wanting and needing to do everything that he or Esther would necessarily kind of want for their baby. Some of the coverage has been very confused, hasn't it, as well, about whether the chair, Sophie Chanduka, is the chair or the chief executive, and I think a lot of the commentary has got very confused about that.
Well, she's definitely not the chief executive. They have a chief executive and an operating and a senior team and country directors and things like that. So the structure is quite clear. She's the chair of the board, and the board have a chief executive and an executive team and staff and volunteers, etc., who do the work for them. So so there might be confusion in the public over which role she plays. But again, that's an interesting thing, where I was talking to newly appointed vice chair of a board this morning, who, I'm talking through, how he adapts to this role and all the rest of it. And in the conversation, it was very clear that because he was talking about this particular frustration he had, and we had to have the conversation about that might be a frustration, but it's not your job. It's like, that's your executive team's matter. You might not like the way they're doing it, but unless they're going against a strategy, how they deliver against it is their problem. Yeah. Your job is to ask the questions about, is this activity helping to progress the charity's objects? Yes. Is it in line with our plans, etc.? And bless him, he was saying, gosh, yes, you're right. I've got to keep reminding myself it's not my job to actually do the work. And I also made the point that sometimes people will do things in the charity in a way that you think a better way of doing it. Now, by all means, you can make those suggestions, but it can only ever be a suggestion. You can't direct in that way operational activity, because then what you're doing is you're stepping out of your strategic role and you're trying to run the thing, and that will only come back to bite you. So it's a challenging role being on a board of trustees, but it's just because it's also, I'm thinking about the sort of patron president influence stuff, Peter, because they don't have any, in law, they have no power. And if a board of trustees was found to have carried out the wishes of a patron, which were contrary to the objects of the charity or the, whatever the charity was doing, it would be the board of trustees who got it in the neck. Yes. It wouldn't be the patron. But on the other hand, it could be quite difficult where a patron's founder. So how did you manage that with Esther Ranson? Because she's also, they're often patrons, and who are founders are often very powerful personalities as well. You don't want to alienate them, but at the same time, you can't. It's not their charity. And again, how do you explain to a patron or co-founder the minute you're not part of the legal body, you're not on the board, or you're not an employee, it's not yours. You don't have the power to direct. You can only influence. So you've got direct experience of that. How do you manage it?
Oh, it's really difficult. I mean, some of my most valuable and rewarding and inspiring conversations where I've learned the very most about how to lead the charity were with Esther, and some of my most frustrating and kind of challenging issues of governance in that line between who's responsible for what were with Esther. And she would, hold her hands up as I would hold my hand up, and said, we would argue with one another, usually about 6 o'clock in the morning, on email, to try and work some of these things through. And it's really difficult because literally this thing is her baby, and she has she did really well, I think, actually, unlike a number of other founders, in the end, to entrust it with the NSPCC. And it was the NSPCC's systems and processes and procedures that created the infrastructure to give life to this promise to be here 24/7 for any child with a worry or a concern, which you can get so far with the enthusiasm of volunteers and goodwill and friendly people. But in the end, it's when those two things come together, it has worked better. So she knew that she was ceding power and control in leading to this kind of merger or amalgamation or kind of relationship, whatever you kind of want to call it. But it doesn't make it any easier. No. And so, but bottom line, she did know what the laws were. And I think even, Childline, hugely associated personally with her, but not utterly dependent
Yeah.
there. And I guess there's some. Just to go back to the role of the chair. I mean, the chair and the trustees are responsible for the strategic direction of the charity, aren't they? And it seems to be that the chair had in this particular case, had a distinct view about the direction that the charity should be going in, and some of the ways in which it was operating, which weren't consistent with, the instincts and the beliefs of the patron. And I had this phrase that I used to use a lot at the NSPCC about being respecting your past but not being defined by it. And that's quite challenging, isn't it? Because typically, and I'm now generalising, I'm not applying this to Esther particularly, but if you've been with an organisation for a long time, right from its birth, you are going to be really steeped in what it was like at the beginning, and what you needed to do to get things done then, which are not the same as an organisation which is kind of growing fast and moving to its next phase or whatever.
Or is more established.
You sort of sense from the outside, don't you, that they were or are on a journey in that charity to move to the next chapter. Yeah. But there are some different views, very strong views, around the board table about the form that direction should take.
Yeah. She may well have been right. I don't know. We're not there. But again, I come back to this point that it's one corporate body. And if that one corporate body makes a decision that you don't agree with, you either have to go along and support that decision, or you have to step away. So I'm not talking about this particularly because I don't know enough about the detail of the thing. But it does also make me think that an awful lot of this could be avoided with some very, very simple practices. So, for example, Peter, I don't know whether you did this at NSPCC, but a role description for the chair, which lays out very clearly what your powers are and, more importantly, what they're not. That talks about the fact that doesn't have things like you line manage the chief executive, which is nonsense, but that you are the facilitator of the relationship between the chief exec and the board, that your job is to provide the support and blah, blah, blah. So if it's actually written down, the same with relationships with ambassadors, with presidents and patrons, having like almost a memorandum of understanding, something written down that says, as a patron, here is what we will give you to support you in your role as patron. Here's what we expect back from you. Here are the limits of your, influence over the charity. And then you can have it written down clearly that you have no power to direct the actions of the charity. Whilst we will be interested in your views, there is no duty upon us to implement that sort of thing. And I honestly think I would be very surprised if there are many charities in the sector who have those sorts of things written down. You'd be gobsmacked how many charities don't have a role description for their chair. And, and that isn't discussed at board level, and it's not agreed, what the decision maker mechanisms are and things like that. So any charities listening, honestly, paperwork is your friend here. It really is. It's not a thing that gets in the way. It's a thing that can help you, and especially when relationships break down, when you can go back to the document and say, look, I understand we disagree on this, but it clearly says here the board must do this. So that would be my advice to anybody listening and now suddenly panicking about if it all goes belly up in their own organisations. It's never too late to get the paperwork in, and you've got a good excuse now, having seen this story.
We talked on a previous podcast about me umming and ahhing about potentially taking on a charity chair role, and reading your book, It's a Battle on the Board. And I can again recommend the chapter in there which does have some Aunt Sally's for the job descriptions of chairs and some of the skills and attributes which you need. And I've definitely been drawing on those in the conversations I've been having to kind of clarify who does what. But what about situations where, because it's easy to say the board has responsibility for setting the strategy and the officers have responsibility for executing the strategy, but that can be quite a blurred area, can't it? And I wonder if have you got any kind of rules of thumb or examples of how to avoid confusion there? Because I don't know if in this case, the trustees are arguing with one another. They're not. Are they arguing about the fundamentals of the direction or the techniques which should be used to achieve that? Well,
I mean, of course, there's no straightforward answer, unfortunately, Peter, because it depends on the charity, the size of the charity, the age of the charity, the scale of the charity. There are so many factors you have to take into account. But there are some simple some simple frameworks to apply. So firstly, the board doesn't have to necessarily write and design the strategy itself. And actually, most boards, particularly of medium to larger charities, probably a really bad idea for you to do that because you don't know enough of the detail. Their job is to ensure that a strategy is set and that they have agreed it as a board. And again, as a board, we think we've got to get everybody to agree. You don't. You need to get, I think a much underused mechanism on boards is voting. It's like where there's conflict and people don't agree, you just go to vote and then the majority wins. And then again, in law, the board is required to go along with, to support the decision of the board because it's one corporate body. And if you can't, you need to move away. You need to step away.
Yeah.
Again, it's you shouldn't ever badmouth the charity, unless the charity is doing something that's breaking charity law or some other law, something fraudulent. To go out and badmouth the charity because you don't like the direction of travel is not a good way to be a trustee, and also would absolutely put other organisations of having you as a trustee if you go and slag off the charity you've just been part of. So, and then in terms of the detail of delivery, so I would always say the job of the board is to ask questions, to test the delivery rather than to tell people how to do the delivery. So, you would pay your executive team to come and say, this is our plan to deliver on this particular strategic objective. This is what we plan to do. And then the job of the board is not to say, any individual say, well, I don't do it that way. I don't agree. You should do it a different way. But to ask questions to say, what makes you believe that that's the best approach? What have you tested against? Have you done your research? Where is the evidence to back it up? Your job as a board is to test the thinking of your executive, not to get involved in, actually telling them how to do it. And also it's stupid because, I think the number of boards, again, I know who want to be involved in the appointment of senior executives, which always makes me laugh hysterically, because your chief executive is accountable for the performance of your senior executives. If you as a board member getting involved and this has actually happened to me where I was forced by my board to interview for senior people with them, and they chose a candidate I really didn't want. And of course, I behaved with integrity around the thing, but the candidate failed completely, but the board couldn't tell me off. They couldn't blame me. Because, I was able to say, well, I didn't want them. You forced them on me, so you cannot possibly hold me accountable for this performance. So any board that gets involved in it is mad, because you can't then hold your chief executive account because you interfered, So, so you're just saying, it's that old thing about you're an astronaut, not a deep sea diver. Your job is to see the whole picture and to ask questions. It's your executive's job to be the deep sea divers and to dive in and root around among the weeds and things like that.
We started with sport, and I can't remember if I've used this analogy before, but it's a favourite one of my last chair at the NSPCC, Neil Burkett. It's a rugby analogy, and he was very strong on the distinct roles which the trustees and the executive board play. They're both really important teams, and they have to get on really well with one another, and they have to be brilliant at doing what they do, but what they do is different. And a really important obligation and responsibility of the chief executive is to enable the two teams to work as effectively as they can. So he was a rugby fan, and in his language, and I know more about rugby now than I did before I joined the charity sector, because rugby is an extremely generous sport, and I've sat at a lot of dinners with a lot of rugby players and had to kind of mug up on the game. But the scrum half is the player in rugby who is the transmission mechanism between the people in the scrum, who are kind of big and strong and pushing the ball forward, and the people who are the backs who pass the ball along to one another and run very fast along the pitch. And so as a chief executive, to really know and understand these governance issues and to be really appreciative of the distinct roles of the two teams is really important. So if you're a rugby fan and you think of yourself as a scrum half, I reckon that works really well. But then another tip I think I would have is that it really helps if both teams operate to the same explicit values and code of conduct. So if, as well as having the role descriptions, you've also got everyone signed up to code of conduct which says this is the way that we behave around here and this is how we treat one another, then if it does start to get a bit scratchy and people are getting confused, you can at least come back to, well, remember, hang on a minute, we're one team, and these are the promises that we've made to one another. So that's another document I think it's worth spending a bit of time on.
The paperwork is your friend. Those things that it's not enough to just do the paperwork, but also regularly having those discussions. How is the relationship going? And that's why it's so important to have governance reviews. I mean, we spoke before, I'm sure, on this podcast about our governance app at DSC, which is completely free to use for any board and any charity to measure their performance. And it's designed around the charity governance code. And we've got, I think, 4,500, 5,000 users of the app now. And in fact, we produced a report last summer where we took all of the data that we gathered from all of these people who'd reviewed their own performance to look at where they, where on average across the sector, where do people think they're doing well in leadership, in risk-taking, decision-taking, in EDI, etc., and to see how they're getting on. But that sort of thing, and the thing about that, that sort of performance review of yourself as a board, I mean, on this one, on our governance app, you basically score a number of questions between 1 and 10. If you think you're particularly good at something, you score 8, 9, 10. If you think you're not very good, you score 2 or 3. The actual number is not really the point, because what will happen is lots of trustees, and we encourage exec to fill it in as well, will have different perspectives, but it's about the conversation that those scores generate. So as somebody said on leadership, for example, the average, some people have said we're a 9 and somebody else said we're a 2. It's not about who's right. It's about, that's really interesting. Let's discuss those perspectives and what can we do as a board to move everybody up to 9, to move our performance to 9. So it's super useful. But again, loads and loads and loads of charities don't do it. And I think there's a fear in it. Like there's the fear of, or what you'll see is, again, I see this all the time, boards of trustees saying we regularly review our performance and we're brilliant. And it's a bit like marking your own homework. You never, ever get a board of trustees to sit together and say we're not very good at governance, because people just don't, for all sorts of reasons. So you really do need to involve your executive, because executives very often have an entirely different view of the performance of the board than the board do of their own performance. But the point is about the discussions. And I think, it's not enough just to have to say, right, you've agreed to be a trustee, sign this code of conduct and here's the roles, but also to make sure they're a regular feature in your reviews. Are we living up to these standards, etc.? And again, I was talking to this chap this morning in his new vice chair role, and I was saying, what would it take for your chief executive to say that's the best trustee I've ever worked with? What would it take for them to say that? And are you doing those things that would make that person say that? And it's not about pleasing the chief executive. It's about saying, if your chief executive thinks you're brilliant, they're going to tell you stuff. They're going to trust you. They're going to ask for your advice. They're going to come to you for support and help. They're going to let you know what the problems are if you have a strong relationship. If you have a weak relationship with them, they're not going to tell you stuff. If your chief executive is afraid to tell you the truth at a board, then what's going to happen is you're not going to get the truth. If the reaction they're expecting is dismissal, sneering, criticism, anger, sarcasm, the assumption they're doing a really bad job, they're not going to give you that information. Who would? You'd have to be mad to. So I always say with boards, what are you doing to make your executive team think you're the best board on the planet? Those are the tests.
Yeah, that's great. Well, what good resources for people to draw on. In the last few months, I've realised that now I'm kind of fending for myself in so many ways of my life. Back when I used to be someone, there's always someone to go and ask these questions of. And for me at the NSPCC, it was a woman called Alison Howe, who's the head of governance and risk and compliance at the NSPCC and the society secretary. And so she would be plugged into all these things. And actually, I've just seen that she has been shortlisted as the Governance Champion of the Year in the Women in Governance Risk and Compliance Awards. So I'm going to give a shout out to Alison, who is great in this, great in this space. So that's really good news for
DSC,
for her.
of course, Peter, is Alison for the vast majority of charities in the sector who can't afford to have somebody who knows all that stuff.
Yeah,
so we do it for them.
Yeah, amazing. Well, it won't be long, will it, before the human beings won't be put forward for any of these awards?
It'll be AI.
Little AI, little bots of one kind or another. So you're ahead of the world on that, absolutely, for sure. Yeah, you are
Actually,
the inhuman champion.
Talking of AI and technology, Peter, I'm just really interested. In Australia, they're banning, aren't they, smartphones for young people, I think under the age of 16, is it? And I know there's a lot of movement and talk, in the UK about doing something similar. And I'm really, really interested in your view in this. I mean, I think it's a bit like taking a pen and paper away from a child, so that they can't write. It seems to me that, that smartphones are part of how they're going to have to navigate the world, and to say you can't learn that vital skill up until the age of 16 seems to me. But I don't know enough about the pros and cons of the issue, and I just wondered if you had a view.
I do. I have lots of views. We're almost out of time, but in a nutshell, I mean, they have spun it extremely well in Australia, and good luck to. I think they're going to ban social media. They're going to ban social media for under 16s. Well, in this country, we have got legislation which should enforce age limits properly if it were rigorously adopted and applied. And there's a debate to be had about whether the age gate for various platforms which attract children and young people should be 13 or 16 or 18. I mean, as time goes on, I feel more and more strongly, the onus and obligation should be on the companies that are designing and developing these products and services to apply those age gates rigorously. And if they can't apply them rigorously, then they should assume there's adults on their sites. And the risk with banning things and kicking kids off. It's almost like, the old days when people said children should be seen and not heard. Children need to grow up in the real world, and they need to be equipped and protected and supported and enjoy their rights to access these amazing opportunities that exist online. So on behalf of the children and young people, it shouldn't be their responsibility either to be shut away for these things or to have to fend for themselves. We should have rigorously applied age limits, and while that's going to take some time to work through, we should be unforgiving and uncompromising in our approach to the companies that are developing these things, and strengthen media and literacy, media and online awareness education for schools and families. And there are some great products around and about to do that. But I think lots of people, it feels impossible at the moment.
But you think those platforms, because if they're really clever from a business point of view, just a bit like how television got to a stage of development where we suddenly had CBeebies and the Kids Channel and things like that, you'd think that they would develop particular platforms, social media platforms for children, where there was no chance of harmful content getting in there. Like with CBeebies, you're not going to accidentally come across an 18-rated program on CBeebies or on any of those. And so I'm just surprised they haven't jumped on that, because I imagine that would be an incredibly lucrative market.
Yeah, there are some good, like, walled garden type services for younger ones. It's getting more and more challenging, I think,
as they get into their teens.
Yeah, sort of 8 to 13 is a complicated time of life. But let's return to this, because there's so much we could
it's going to keep cropping up as well, isn't it? Let's be honest. And we've definitely run out of time, I'm sure.
We have, unfortunately. Well, I look forward to seeing you next week after I've spent a few days in the sun. Somerset will have their first victory under their belt. Ebbsfleet United will be the Kent Senior Cup champions, and everyone will have had a lovely weekend.
Well, good luck, Peter, to you and all of Somerset. You're my second favourite team after Surrey. So, if we're not winning, I want you to win. Is that good enough? Thank you very much.
Yeah, I suppose so. It'll have to be for now.
Okay, bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye.
Bye, Peter. See you next week.